Great. Okay. I'll make a brief plea that the room gets so loud because 2 of the walls are glass, and I just in particular am prone to find it difficult to hear speakers when the room is quite noisy. So if you could just keep your bench murmurings to an excited and productive low murmur, that would be appreciated. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome up to the floor the first speaker for the Affirmative team.
In this speech, I'm going to run you through some quick setup to get us started and underway. Then I'm going to take you through my 2 key points in this debate. Firstly, surrounding how our side of the house will reduce inequality, and secondly, surrounding how we will reduce obscene wealth held by the super wealthy. Liv at second will run her split on how we'll be able to improve competition for small businesses and how this is a discrete benefit gained on our side of the house. So what do we need to understand for this debate first and foremost? Firstly, our model. Our model states that in countries like New Zealand, we would primarily look at implementing taxes like a capital gains tax to reduce wealth inequality. This is where we see the burden of inequality being held in the majority of developed countries. In developing countries, where a lot of the crux of this debate will be focused on, heavy taxes will be firstly implemented on high income people and the income that they earn. There would be high taxes on companies which are able to get away withholding the significant amount of tax-free revenue. And we would also look at implementing, once again, stronger wealth measures such as a wealth tax, capital gains tax, etc., etc. In countries like the Cayman Islands, where they have a 0% tax, and a lot of countries use it as a way to, a lot of companies use it as a way to funnel their revenue away, we would look to increase this around to about 35% to reduce tax evasion used by these big multinational companies. We would implement strong IRDs, inland revenue departments, to be able to hold these individuals and these companies to account to make sure that they are paying their fair share of tax, and there would be strong penalties introduced in each country to ensure that tax is being paid. We think wealthy people generally inherit the majority of their wealth from their family, and this wealth is passed through. We say that wealthy people are able to reinvest their wealth through using measures like equity, which they already have, and this is how they're able to further perpetuate the amount of wealth which they hold, and they're able to get wealthier. On the contrast, poor people don't have this backing to be able to invest in themselves to be able to get wealthier because they don't have any wealth to begin with. This means that they can't get ahead and they're at a significant disadvantage compared to wealthy people. Normal people ultimately want a comfortable life. They want to be able to put food on the table. They want to have a warm and dry home for themselves and their family to live in, and they want opportunities for them and their kids to be able to get ahead and to create a better life for themselves. In this debate, we simply need to prove that we will gain a more equitable society and better outcomes for poor people, who we have identified as the key stakeholder in this debate. On to my first point surrounding reducing inequality. Inequality is strife across the world. The statistics show that 90% of people hold 10% of the world's wealth. This is disgusting. We don't think this is right. We think that poor people should have fair opportunities to be able to get ahead. We want to reduce the wealth gap and intergenerational poverty. Increased tax means increased investment into poor people. Here's 3 key mechanisms to demonstrate this to you today. Firstly, would have increased investment in education. Let's take a country like Nigeria, for example, which has limited education for the majority of people and practically no education for girls in particular. With higher tax revenues in Nigeria, who in comparison have effectively had no tax revenue prior, we're able to invest more in things like better teachers, books, classrooms. This not only improves education in Nigeria, but it's also incredibly important because it sets up an education system for girls, which they otherwise wouldn't be able to get on the negating sides. In the negating sides world, where this investment for education doesn't exist. This is a discrete benefit that we gain on our side of the house. We're able to improve education in Nigeria, particularly for young women there. Secondly, would have increased investment in health. Let's picture this, for example. You're a small Bangladeshi boy. You're dying of hypothermia, dehydration, and you go to your local hospital, and what do you see? It's literally outdated, falling apart. There's no beds. You've got people that are lying down in the corridor. You've got nurses and doctors that are overworked, and you're not able to get any treatment. Greater tax revenue means that we are ultimately able to invest this money, which would otherwise be held by the wealthy and used for their own self-interest, into these hospitals to be able to support vulnerable people, so that boy can go to and see a doctor or a nurse quicker. He can go and actually have a bed instead of sitting around on the floor. And the hospital that he's in is a world-class system, like we see in Nordic countries such as Denmark, for example, where they have significantly higher tax revenues and some of the best healthcare in the world, and compared to what we would have on the negating side of the house, with no increased tax revenue, which means no more nurses, no more doctors on their side of the house. Thirdly, we'd have increased investment and a wide range of amenities that people depend upon. This looks like better water pumping and sewage systems in villages that exist in countries like Sudan, where this literally doesn't exist. This looks like better housing and for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to go home and have a warm, dry home. This looks like better roads for people, so they're able to get from A to B. They're able to get to work quicker and easier, and this creates better opportunities for them. What are the key outcomes from this point? Firstly, we have better healthcare. More doctors, more nurses. This is a key positive benefit. Secondly, better education. This looks like more teachers, better books, better classrooms, particularly education for like young women, as we've proven with our mechanism in this debate. Thirdly, with better education, this means that people are learning better skills. This leads to higher paying jobs in the future. This creates better opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't have had opportunities to be able to go and enter these higher paying jobs. Fourthly, this means like better amenities. It looks like people who otherwise, instead of drinking dirty water, are able to go and access clean water, which they otherwise wouldn't have been able to with this wealth being held. What are the key impacts for this debate? Look, ultimately, this impacts vulnerable people who are in poverty. This impacts children who are unable to support themselves because they do not have the means to do so. On our side of the house, we would support them to be able to get ahead. I'm happy to take a POI.
Are you aware that the progressivity of the tax system refers to revenue and income, not wealth?
Progressivity of the tax system means that you are taxing people more. This looks like wealth, this looks like income. We've proven both within our model so far. On to my second point surrounding reducing obscene wealth. Why is it so important that money is in the hands of the government compared to these multinational companies or billionaires? Ultimately, governments have better incentives to invest in their citizens compared to billionaires. Billionaires ultimately want to improve wealth for themselves, so they have more wealth in their hands. We say that governments ultimately have this underlying incentive to look to invest in their citizens, to invest in the outcomes that their citizens gain rather than billionaires. Therefore, we would prefer governments to be able to hold this money to invest in their citizens rather than billionaires who we've never seen in a world prior where they would be investing in these people. We have two key mechanisms to demonstrate this to you today. Firstly, surrounding reducing the wealth gap. We see that the wealth gap has been able to occur in the first place, as I've characterized before, because wealthy people have had all this money behind them, so they've been able to use that wealth to invest in themselves to be able to gain even more wealth. On our side of the house, we are lessening the impact of the wealth gap. What this ultimately means is that when we're moving the wealthy compared to the poor people closer, we are firstly reducing the power imbalance that wealthy people have over poor people, which means that poor people are commonly being exploited and not getting the same opportunities that wealthy people are getting. And secondly, we're giving poorer people opportunities through diverting that wealth, which would otherwise be sitting in the trust funds being held in the Cayman Islands, into these poor people, into improving opportunities for them from education to housing, etc., etc. For example, my second mech for New Zealand, the introduction of a capital gains tax, it means that a major source of untaxed income which exists in New Zealand, housing, would be taxed. This means that people are able to get into houses in New Zealand when we're having some of the most unaffordable houses in the developed world. This is incredibly important. This means that vulnerable people are able to get into houses and be able to live in a warm, dry, comfortable home. What are the key outcomes for this? Now the system, because the system is now less biased towards rich people and allows poor people to have better opportunities, it's easier for poor people to break the poverty cycle and to be able to get ahead. We reduce the wealth that obscenely wealthy people hold, and we are able to instead channel this disproportionate wealth away from them and towards poor people. This is incredibly important because poor people are unable, as I've said before, to support themselves. They don't have the means to be able to support themselves to get ahead. We are offering them the opportunity to be able to get ahead through taking money away from the obscenely wealthy who don't need the money and diverting this money towards much needed investment which will change the lives of millions of vulnerable people around the world. So proud to propose in today's debate.
Now we have a turn speaker for that speech, and now we'll hear from the first speaker for the opposition.
grandstanding we heard about Nigerian schools and more education for young women halfway across the world, what we didn't hear about is anything actually related to the progressivity of the tax system. I would like to flag for the panel today that the progressivity of the tax system refers to earnings of income and revenue by companies and individuals. That is what it means. That is what the motion dictates. But even so, that means a capital gains tax on wealth is not included in the progressivity of the tax system on earnings. That is very important. We stand by this definitional challenge. But even if we accept that characterization, I'm going to defend a capital gains tax only on stock purchases and exchanges with profits above $10,000 or above $1 million for land transfers. It's a clear accounts model I'll get into later. But first, 3 points for the House. First, on how this punishes the middle class and worsens equity. Second, on the far better alternative of this capital gains tax only on rich individuals. Finally, on public buy-in. First, then, on how this punishes the middle class.
On that point.
Contextually, how do low middle income individuals and entities such as small businesses increase their wealth? We think this broadly looks like two things. The first is to say they get broad increases in income and revenue. This looks like rising through promotions to get salary increases. Looks like small businesses promoting sales of actual transfers of goods and services. The second is to say that they have some asset purchases, like land, but not a lot. This looks like middle income earners having one investment property or some stock, but not a
On that
lot.
point.
I think the important thing to flag here again is that proposition has completely missed the point of the progressivity of the tax system. A progressive tax system means you are charging people more tax as they rise through the ranks, not just vaguely asserting that we'll have a capital gains tax on the highest individuals. That is not a progressive tax system. And I can't let this to you clear enough because it means that entire case is basically defending the alternative side of the house. What does a progressive tax system actually mean? It means two things.
On that point.
First, it punishes you for climbing up the ranks. It punishes you for climbing up the salary ladder because at the point you do, the greater number of brackets that you encounter or the greater tax paid as you do so disincentivizes you from doing so, and you also feel as though you're being punished for climbing up the ranks in the progressive system. Again, I flag that's what progressive means. The second is to say it's a disproportionate effect on their revenue streams because of the fact that they typically rely on income and salary. That is a type, but even if we accept their ridiculous characterization that wealth and assets also are included in progressive tax systems, which I might add they haven't modeled for us at all, so I can't actually attack directly, it means that even as you do so and increase your assets, you are being taxed significantly more. You feel as though you're punished for climbing up the ranks. Comparatively, how do these wealthy individuals earn and keep their wealth? Two things. The first is say almost none of their money is from income. This looks like billions reporting almost zero income, huge conglomerates reporting no profits, despite the fact that they're clearly extremely wealthy companies. The second is that they are focused on assets. This looks like CEOs and executives paid with stocks, purchasing large swaths of land, stock buybacks now accounting for 70% of large companies. Okay. Here's what we expected a model about progressive taxes from proposition, but instead they gave us just assertions about progressive capital gains tax. I'm going to tell you that we still win even if we debate on the grounds of capital gains tax, because we are going to target the specific large stock buybacks, the large swaths of land purchases, as opposed to just a random mom and pop who bought one investment property and sold it because they decided they want to go to a retirement home instead of continuing to do so. We think that these rich legislators have greater capacity to dodge these taxes than the middle class. Two things. The first is to say they have teams of lawyers to find tax shelters that are legal. The second is they have the reduced capacity to do so for the middle class. That means when you progressively implement any tax system, the rich people are still going to get away with it, particularly if it's income-based, because they can simply move their money to tax shelters like Ireland, the Cayman Islands. Comparatively, the middle class has to do a cost-benefit analysis about whether the thing is actually worth it to do so, because of the fact that these teams of lawyers obviously cost a lot of money. In the status quo, we tell you that they often don't hide their money because of the fact that they understand the cost is greater than the benefits. Let's look at how this is affected if you disproportionately affect these earners. The rich continue to hide their money aggressively, particularly income, as per the status quo. We have two outcomes for these middle income earners. The first is that they either continue to not implement measures to dodge tax, meaning they disproportionately get affected by any tax that's progressive, or the second is to say that they do start dodging taxes, leading losses to revenue and government revenue streams, because the cost-benefit analysis have now shifted. You are more incentivized to hide your money than you were before. This negatively improves equity. Okay, second then, how is it better to have a capital gains tax only on the ultra wealthy? Contextually, capital gains taxes normally impact these assets, not salary, which is what I've been telling you this whole time. Why do we defend a capital gains tax only on these wealthiest individuals? Because it is those individuals who are making the bulk of this wealth hoarding, and it does not punish the rest of the income brackets that proposition doesn't even talk about, which is ridiculous because that is what the motion is about. They instead talk about Nigerian education workers, hospitals. This is not what the motion is about. Okay, let's look at what these capital gains taxes we would have. So these would be levied on things like stock, land, and any other sale on the appreciation of capital, profits on the appreciation of capital. We think there are two approaches for why this is a better alternative. The first is enforceability, the second is equity. The first is on enforceability. Okay, for these rich individuals, it is much more openly available to tax their capital gains as opposed to their income, or for tax their capital gains on these ultra wealthy. We have the capacity to do so. Two things. The first is to say it's less malleable to accounting tricks. You can't claim zero income on a land sale because you sold that to someone. The government can find that record and see how much you sold it for a profit at, because you can't just hide your income like you would in the alternative world. The second is to say there are requirements on things like New York stock exchanges and the real estate market to have these transactions listed. The government can find these transactions. What does this mean? It means that in general it is easier to tax these wealthy transfers, such as these huge transfers above $10,000 for which the SEC requires these declarations, than it would be to comb through literally everyone's stock transfers. I mean, I think this is really important because it means that they're defending a world where the government creates a whole new parallel progressive capital gains tax system where everyone's stock exchanges comb through to get like a tiny bit of revenue from small purchases. We think this is a waste of time and energy. We prefer them to focus on these large purchases. Second, then on equity. Okay. Two things. The first is to say you target assets of the ultra wealthy, because for all they say, oh, we hate the ultra wealthy, they're actually targeting everyone, not these huge purchases that take up the vast majority. Second is to say it might improve conditions. This looks like the fact that these rich investors hoard so much land in countries like New Zealand that housing prices have been driven to the brink. If they are told that selling that land will now incur a heavy capital gains tax, they are no longer as likely to do that. We think this is comparatively better than taxing everyone's land purchase, because sometimes mom and pops do have some land for investment properties. We're okay with that. We are about social mobility, not what they're about. Okay, I'll take that point.
How is a capital gains tax not an example of progressive tax when you are taxing the wealthy more?
A capital gains tax, you have not modeled for us to actually be taxing the less wealthy any less, right? Because it means increasing the proportional tax you pay as you increase the income brackets. You can't just model in that you think it already exists. You have to, if you want to defend that, you have to actually defend what it looks like now. You haven't told us anything about that. You're not increasing the progressivity of the tax system that exists. You're just implementing a new tax on the ultra wealthy. That is not the progressivity of earnings earned. Okay, finally then public buy-in. Why do we think it's better to implement this tax only the ultra wealthy, not progressive for everyone else? We think that this gives greater government buy-in at the point you target those people who are doing the most harm to the economy through the hoarding of assets and land, as opposed to everyone. The sentiment, for instance, that if you do it progressively, that the government is here to take everyone's money, you're not targeting your efforts on the most wealthy. That means you get less public buy-in for other incentives and tax benefits, like redistribution of wealth, which we remind you also requires this government and public buy-in. At the end of this, I think side proposition has failed to understand what they're defending. They can't win this debate. Proud to oppose.
Now we have our next speaker for that speech, and now we'll hear from the second speaker for the proposition.
Today, SideNeg's case has existed solely on the fact that a capital gains tax won't work and that it isn't actually a progressive tax system and that it's not income at all, right? They failed to give any actual responses to any of Tane's material, aside from the fact that, oh, that won't work because you didn't explain it in your model when Tane clearly did. All right, a few things to do in this speech. Firstly, on giving some responses to the material that they've given us so far in terms of capital gains tax and just influence on like the middle class and stuff. Secondly, I'll be giving a substantive split on why we get far better outcomes for small businesses. So what's the material we've heard specifically pertaining to the capital gains tax? Note that they've basically just said that, oh, it's not actually income. We have a few key responses here, right? We think if you're selling a house and then gaining profit from it, that's income. We think this is typically the untaxed earnings, and that would be taxed under our progressive tax model. We've also talked a lot about, in Tane's speech, how the fact that we're willing to increase make taxes higher for those that earn more, and we don't necessarily have to do it for the lower class or the middle class. Note that a lot of our material specifically pertains to helping the lower and middle class when they could not provide anything apart from keeping the status quo, and everyone had investment property, so it would be bad if they taxed them on it, right? Okay. So in terms of the capital gains tax, right, they talked a lot about the middle class when they talked about this. They said that some people have investment properties, so it's going to be really harmful if, we tax capital gains, right? We think that most people don't have investment properties. Most of the middle class does not have an investment property. That's a pretty privileged take to have, right? And even if they do, we think that you're probably not probably should still be taxed on it, right? Especially if you're selling it, especially in this market. People need as much help as they possibly can, particularly pertaining to the lower socioeconomic classes. They talked about, selling your home so you can go to a retirement home. The rich can dodge this tax, right? We just don't think that's true under our side of the house. We've given you lots of material at Tane in terms of actually being able to tax the rich better, because under their side of the house, they've not actually told you how they're going to tax the rich. We've told you that we're going to increase taxes. We're going to actually look at where they're getting their unearned income from, what we're actually going to do with that in terms of putting it back into the government that can be used so much better there, and that has really great outcomes that none of which actually went responded to, so they still all stand in the debate. In terms of they talked a lot about buy-in and how it's going to be only good and how they're specifically going to tax the ultra wealthy progressively, right? Note that we're completely happy to stand for that. We stand for progressive taxation systems. We're happy to tax rich more. But that's what we actually want to do. We've told you this along our line so far today with limited response there. That means we're still happy to do it. They've actually not explained how we can't do that. And they've also talked about social mobility, right? We think that they didn't respond to any of Tane's material in terms of widening the wealth gap. That means there's going to be less social mobility in terms of classes. Substantive split. Oh, take a point if there is one.
You mentioned that you have described how you're going to get this tax revenue. Simply saying the money goes back to the government is not describing how it would be taxed. Are you aware of that?
Okay, so I think Tane outlined pretty clearly in his speech that we'd have IRD in developing countries and in developed countries that would actually look after this money, take it to the government, and Tana gave you a lot of material on where this money would actually go in terms of education, resources that might look like better sewage systems or better water management, which is really important. It's particularly pertaining to developing countries. Note that they didn't respond to any of our material there. That still stands. So even if this material might not be the best for developed countries, even though it is, when we gave you examples like Sweden, Norway, other really high tax systems, no thank you. It's still really beneficial for developing countries, and that's super important in the debate because they're also vulnerable. That's a large group of people that we should be looking after. Okay, in terms of outcomes for small businesses, what do we need to understand for this point to work, right? Big companies, under the status quo, have the ability to move their assets and funnel their money overseas where they're massively lower taxes, right? Tani talked a little bit about this in terms of the Cayman Islands, but specifically pertain to Google in the Cayman Islands, Apple in Ireland, other examples like that where they get taxed massively lower compared to where they should be taxed, or just evading that in general.
Point?
No, thank you. So, in terms of better outcomes, two key mechanisms. We've got more equal taxation, and then this leads to the second mechanism on an even playing field, right? Smaller businesses will never have these resources, first mechanism, to be able to move overseas, to be able to avoid these taxes, and when they will still be comparatively taxed much higher compared to the income or revenue of these bigger businesses. So if they're going to be taxed more, no matter what, under side neg, that's super harmful, especially when you consider that a lot of these local businesses or smaller businesses specifically feed into communities that actually care about their people way more than these really big companies do. Second mechanism on evening the playing field. making it more difficult for big businesses lets small businesses succeed more. Like, even if we make it more difficult by taxing them more, right, we think comparatively they're still going to have more money. It just makes it much, much easier for these smaller businesses, and that's really important. We've already proved that we get fairer taxation at me and Tane, but this even playing field allows for more competition, better expansion, and this is true because big companies can't just like stomp on small businesses due to unfair taxation. So what are the outcomes of this point? Why is that super important in today's debate? We get far better outcomes for local economies, right? Small businesses have a greater incentives to look after their employees because they're like community-based, they want to look after them, might have family connections, and they might also be more likely to leave. Small businesses actually look after their employees way better, which is important in vulnerable communities, whereas compared to like the example of a sweatshop worker, because this overseas company is based somewhere that there's no taxes or protection. It's far easier to support these companies when they become more competitive, or small businesses when they become more competitive. For example, like, it's much easier to support a small business in Romania because their prices are cheaper compared to like trying to pay for expensive things from Google. No, thank you. We also let small startups and businesses thrive more. There's far more competition there, better products, better prices, more innovation for consumers. This pushes money back into local economies instead of back to overseas economies where multinational companies are based or send their money. No, they've actually given no analysis or response to Tane's material. Or no, they haven't actually proved why people that earn a lot of money or companies that earn a lot of money can actually funnel this money away or hide their income. They just said they've had, so we think that's not necessarily true when they've not been able to prove that. In terms of the impacts of this, why does this matter? Why is this important? Right, we think that big businesses have a lot more power over small businesses currently, and that's really, really harmful. They're currently much more vulnerable. They have a lot more vulnerable employees, and they'll never be able to have the same benefits that big companies do. We are able to change the systems that cause this, and therefore we're able to change this. We're actually able to uplift small businesses, and that's incredibly important in today's debate, especially when you take into all of our material that went under-responded on the actual social impacts of this, why it's so much better for people, why it's so much better for the lower class, and why that's so important in today's debate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now we'll hear from the second speaker for the opposition.
Both sides have agreed that increasing social mobility is incredibly important. However, it is incredibly difficult to actually increase the social mobility, to actually create any kind of meaningful change when most of the people that you are punishing are part of the middle class, are lower than the middle class, and you do not actually do enough to actually punish those who are perpetuating these huge class divides. Today I'm going to talk about who largely increases social mobility, but first I want to talk about what a progressive tax system looks like. A progressive tax system involves progressively increasing tax by income, directly but not effectively. A capital gains tax may effectively potentially have some more of an impact on rich people because they're more likely to have stocks, but it does not directly progressively tax people with a higher income more in comparison to how much they earn. The affirming team has tried to prove that it is in some way progressive because of this effectiveness. However, we tell you this is incredibly clearly not what this is. Okay, this means that a capital gains tax could never be progressive because a capital gains tax will never impact everybody's income proportionally to what the income is, even if it is like progressive within the capital gains bracket. Which means that any arguments that they make for a capital gains tax directly benefit us because we are able to actually argue for this progressive capital gains tax. It's also important to note that even if they could try and claim that you could have a a capital gains tax as well, it is incredibly likely that when you have a society where people are where you increase these tax rates where you actually progressively, tax income, it is much, much harder to have the political capital to push for an actual capital gains tax, because people think, well, we have lots of tax already, people have lots of, arguments and excuses, all of the any time and energy spent pushing towards this actual tax system, decreases the time that can be spent on an actual capital gains tax system. This also involves, how extreme this capital gains tax is likely to be, because they could only ever get a tiny marginal capital gains tax when these tax rates are already really, really high. People are less likely to want these increased amounts of tax. On the outside of the house, we can support not only a capital gains tax, but absolutely best case for them, a hugely increased capital gains tax comparatively. Okay, moving into who increases social mobility. So their biggest push here has essentially been that it massively increases tax revenue. First of all, by having a capital gains tax, both sides have already agreed most of huge amounts of wealth in the world, most wealth in the world is held in these, in capital, and by taxing these capital gains, it's likely to hugely increase this income, and so we're likely to simply get just more money, more tax revenue to actually do this. But secondly, they're likely to actually it's incredibly unlikely they'll get an increase in tax revenue and may even go down, because with the reduced public buy-in that Chris has already described, it is likely that people are likely to want to pay less tax. We've told you, this looks like middle-class people getting lawyers, middle-class people trying to avoid tax, shifting their income around so that it seems like they have less income, paying less tax. It looks like things like cash payments, cash transfers, and things like that, so that they do not have to declare it and do not have to pay tax on it. And because of this hugely reduced public buy-in, Chris also told you that this is likely to decrease people's general willingness to buy into this kind of tax system, which means in both the short term and the long term, but especially long term, people are unlikely to pay this tax, because even if this tax could be decreased, even if some kind of capital gains tax could potentially be implemented under their side of the house, people just simply don't like paying tax anymore. People have learned how to avoid tax. People have learned that it's actually a possibility for them. People have learned that they can do this, and so they're much more likely to do this in the future. So they're unlikely to get any significant increase in tax revenue, and they actually really severely risk both short-term and long-term losing huge amounts of tax revenue. It is simply impossible to achieve the huge amounts of social mobility that they have described without this tax revenue, because they tell us that is their mechanism for social mobility, right? Paying for education, paying for schools, things like that. This is what we actually get. We also got things like social mobility. We also heard that equality is going to be super increased just because these rich people are going to have less money. Firstly, we've already told you these really ultra wealthy people are likely to have less money under our side of the house, but more importantly, social mobility is the main impact that they've claimed here. The really, apart from some vague principle about how it's really unfair, the actual impact that we're talking about of getting people, into better homes, getting people happier, hinges on the social mobility part, not necessarily any kind of equity point. I'll take a point of information now.
How does your point surrounding middle class avoiding tax with cash payments hold any weight, when that is literally an example of tax fraud, which we've said continuously through our model that we would tackle with greater enforcement through the IRD?
The point hinges on the idea that people are more likely to commit tax fraud because they don't like tax. And yes, this also includes not legally. We've also already clearly told you that people can do this legally. People can change things around legally so they pay less tax. However, the willingness to commit this tax fraud is also really bad. And also when people are more likely to do these legal things, societally, that reduces societal cohesion, reduces trust in the government. This looks like things like people just generally being more unhappy in everyday life, more unhappy with the government. This looks like people not trusting the government when they tell them to do important things like go and get vaccinated, and when you have a global pandemic. This reduced trust in the government and generally reduced societal cohesion is really, really harmful. Okay. We've also heard a lot of talk about how small businesses are going to be really, really benefited from this. However, businesses earn money too, and businesses tend to earn more money than people themselves because they pay multiple employees, they just generally do more work than a single person themselves, which means that a progressive tax system, and especially a significantly progressive tax system, is likely to increase this money on small businesses. And as these small businesses try to grow and become more prosperous, it reduces it continues to increase, which reduces the huge incentive that these small businesses have to try and grow, to try and get more employees, to increase to increase employment and we've already heard that small businesses are great at employing. Small businesses treat their employees really well. So we support small businesses remaining alive, small businesses continuing to be incentivized to exist in the world.
On that point.
But when they're taxing small businesses, this is really, really harmful. Okay, it's also important to note that a progressive capital gains tax is always going to decrease social mobility, because even if they could somehow argue for a progressive capital gains tax, which I've been incredibly clear that they cannot, but if they continue to push that, a progressive capital gains tax is still unfair, because any kind of these progressive taxation systems, when they're implemented to this extent, are likely to this significant extent, and just in general, are likely to decrease people's motivation to increase the amount of money they have to increase their income, and to potentially for these like mum and dad rental people to increase the amount of assets they have. And we've already told you this is incredibly helpful. Overall, they have completely failed to manage to prove that they're going to get any kind of increasing social mobility, because they have hinged all of their mechanisms on something that they simply cannot do. However, we have all gone further than this, and we've also told you that even if they could argue for an actually progressive income system, it is unlikely that this would have any kind of economic or social benefit at all. We are the ones that get people into their homes. We are the ones that get the Nigerian children educated. Proud to oppose.
Now, Mahi, I'd like to take the speaker to that stage, and we'll hear from the third speaker for the proposition.
The affirming team have focused their case largely on capital gains and ignored most other parts of our model and the discrete benefits they bring to developing countries. They told us at the end of the second speech, they said, oh, we're going to help Nigerian girls get education. How? They haven't told us. Right. 3 questions I'm going to be answering in today's debate. Firstly, who is our model going to affect most? Secondly, do we get greater equality from that? And thirdly, are people going to buy into this system? Okay, so firstly, who are these taxes going to target? And we would like to know that this deals with a lot of the material on capital gains tax and why it's not progressive, because it taxes everyone. And so if we're going to prove that having capital gains tax capital gains taxes specifically are going to be targeting rich people more, we're going to say that a lot of their argument breaks down right there. So firstly, the first kind of push we had was on capital gains, and the first kind of line of analysis we heard from them was that this affects everyone. No, it doesn't. Why? Because who actually owns property? People who have the money to afford it. Who can afford it? People who are rich. Right, so what we've established here is that they've said, oh, well, poor people, middle class people, they're going to be affected too. No, they're not, because they don't have money to buy the houses in the first place. And secondly, we say that rich people are earning things on a much greater scale. We literally heard from them how this forms large parts of their income. So we don't see by how taxing this is not like a progressive tax system. And secondly, another thing we've heard from them is, under our model, we're only going to tax the super wealthy because, capital gains tax is not like a tax. It's not a progressive tax system. Okay, so this is definitely a progressive tax system if they're only taxing the super wealthy in the first place. Just because they say that they have like a better way of taxing, of like having a progressive tax system, still means that they're defending a progressive tax system in the first place, which is what we stand for on our side of the house. And there's no reason why our capital gains tax, we cannot like specifically include it to majorly affect the like poor, to majorly affect rich people more. They haven't actually provided us any reasons why like not taxing rich people more is going to be like worse for worse in general. And secondly, we have had no real we've introduced a lot of other measures that are not capital gains tax. This is things like introducing tax brackets in like other countries, like, and this is definitely this definitely fits their definition of a progressive tax system. So we're saying that like introducing tax brackets into the Cayman Islands in the first place is definitely like a progressive tax system, because now we're taxing these wealthy people that weren't being taxed before, and that is basically what they've told us a progressive tax system is. And we've had no engagement with any of this material, which means that even if you disregard everything about capital gains taxes, we are still definitely getting discrete benefits. We're still definitely pushing like a progressive tax system in general. This material still stands, and it's so important because these people in these countries are a lot more vulnerable than like in New Zealand and stuff. They cannot win by saying that like we haven't had a system, because we've had a system and we've had no pushback against large parts of this system. They continue to ignore it. Okay, secondly, on equality, and we say this is important because if we prove that we get like more equality for vulnerable people, then we're effectively like breaking in the power balance and giving them like greater means to like look after themselves. Okay, so the first thing that we've kind of heard from them is like this is going to disproportionately affect the middle class people more, like, you know, this is bad for them and stuff. Right, so firstly, we've told you why is this just not going to happen? Because when we're increasing tax brackets, we're not increasing tax for the middle class, we're increasing it for the extremely wealthy. We've told you this, like, we've never ever said that we're going to like tax middle class people more. We said we're going to tax the wealthy people more. That's entirely what our model stands on in the first place. And secondly, we'd also like to note that, like, in general, like, have any of the other stuff they said on capital gains, this is obvious. Again, they're not going to be as affected by this because they're like literally they don't have the same amount of money to improve houses. And we say by like introducing things like we've told you we get from outside the house, like for example better healthcare, better education, this is going to directly benefit the middle class more, because they're the people who might not necessarily have had the best education in the first place, and now they get it. So this actually allows them to like, because they've got better education, more of them are able to go to university, more of them are able to get like high-paying jobs, etc. Okay, this leads on to the second push we heard, so on social mobility, and basically they said that, on outside the house, it's going to be hard for people to move through the different classes. Okay, why is this not true? Because the reason why we currently have it hard for people to move through the middle classes, because of the current system and the current wealth gap that is forced under less progressive tax system at the moment. If we're taxing the wealthy more, I'll step you through this. If we're taxing the wealthy people more, then these wealthy people have less money to go and invest and reinvest and get wealthier and wealthier. By taxing this, we're reducing this power. Therefore, we're reducing the wealth, the gap between the middle class and the wealthy. This makes it easier for a middle class person to move up, or a low class person to move up from being poorer to wealthy, because there's not the same gap in the first place. So we definitely get greater social mobility on our side of the house. Okay, and another thing. Okay, I'll take your POI now.
The motion requires you to significantly increase progressivity, or the degree of progression of tax on earnings of all individuals and companies. How do you contend that with the fact that a tax only on the ultra wealthy does not do that?
Because we're taxing wealthy people more. I'm sorry, as far as I'm aware, this motion was not about increasing everybody's taxes. It was increasing the taxes of the rich corporations and stuff. They cannot just tell us that we're not doing a progressive tax system when we've told you time and time again that we are. They just, this argument doesn't stand. We've given you so many reasons why we are, having this system. Okay, and now we're going to move on to now on small businesses, which we've heard. Again, it's going to be unequal for them because they're going to be taxable. Okay, so under their will, these small businesses can't exist in the first place because they're outcompeted by big businesses like Apple or Google, which can go and go off to the Cayman Islands and put their stuff there. This happens under their side of the house, and therefore, because they have these ways to escape tax, escape tax and stuff, they're able to
they're able to like get ahead, and they're automatically on a better footing than these smaller businesses on our side of the house. These businesses are getting taxed in the first place, which automatically makes it easier for small businesses because at least now they're being taxed the same amount. And secondly, we never actually said that like we're going to tax the small businesses more. They're already being taxed in the first place. We're taxing the big businesses more, which increases it increases inequality and makes it easier for like these. And it makes it easier for these small businesses to exist. We both agreed that it is a good thing. However, we're the side that actually told you how this is going to happen when all they have to defend is a status quo in which this is not actually working very well because these big businesses are able to escape tax evasion on our side of the house. We've told you how this is no longer going to happen. Okay, and I'll move on now to so what have we proved from this? We basically proved to you that we're getting money, we're able to tax people more, we're getting more money from this, and therefore this money, which they told us, we haven't told you like how we're going to get money. Yes, we are. We're taking the money, we're giving it to the government, and then we're spending it on these things that, like education, like stuff. This is how we get better education in Nigeria. They have not told you how they're going to do this. We have, therefore we win this. And so finally, briefly on buying, we basically heard, people are not going to like it. Like the first line of analysis we heard from second was that middle class people will get lawyers with whose money. Lawyers are expensive. Sense check here. No, they're not. And secondly, what is their like legal ground for doing this? You can't just like sue the government for increasing tax when like that's literally in the government's right to do stuff, especially since it's not these middle class people who are going to be as affected by the stuff anyway. And secondly, we heard that like, we're going to have cash, people are just going to try and avoid this, we're going to have increased fraud. Well, we've told you why we actually get decreased fraud, because we're introducing in developing countries a lot of these kind of like systems to like avoid this in the first place. Okay, like people, no matter what they tell you about people can't buy in, they actually don't really have a choice. Like everyone has to pay taxes, this is the law in most countries, and we're able to get it better. So what are the discrete benefits we get that they don't? We get reduced government debt because we're getting more money, we're able to invest this more into like things, and therefore by investing this more we're able to get reduced inequality, better education, all of the stuff that they have not told you how they're going to get. We're getting it better for small businesses. In the end, we're the side that actually proves all of these things while they're relying on just telling you that our arguments don't exist. Thank you.
Mummy had that second speaker for that speech, and now we'll hear from the third speaker for the opposition.
I'm going to do a couple things in this speech today. First of all, I'm going to have a defense of the definitional challenge we proposed from the get-go. Second of all, the unique harms of progressivity, even if you don't buy the definitional challenge. And third of all, companies and social mobility. First of all, on the defense. First of all, on progressivity, they only have so much fiat. They did this on both companies and individuals, as in the inflow side, companies and individuals. Second of all, progressivity is within the bracketed system. We literally heard this when we had a clarification. And so we think it's not progressive at the point you only tax the rich people. We think that's just literally levying tax on the rich people more. It's not progressivity. Progressivity implies scaling. And we didn't, even if they did mean this, we didn't hear any reasoning on bracketing, what kind of brackets this would be, what kind of rich people. We think that more brackets equals the middle class impacted as well, because at the point you have more tax brackets, it's increased scaling. But we also think you get more of a burden to the middle class. At the point you have more tax needing to be paid from the rich people, and the rich people won't pay it, and the poor people now don't either, so all the burden goes to the middle class. We think that to defend our definitional challenge, the motion was on progressivity, and we don't think this is progressivity. We think that this is them just trying to levy taxes to the rich people, and we told you this doesn't imply, and this is not in the spirit of the motion of progressivity, of scaling. And furthermore, they told us that they would somehow manage to get like the IRD to like really enforce this. First of all, we think the marginal increase and like trying to get the IRD to do these things, especially in countries like Nigeria,
is outweighed by the immense radical increase of rich people who want to now hire lawyers to keep their income, to keep their income taxes. We think that this will outweighs it. But uniquely, we think when we tax capital gains taxes, as we brought you down the line, this looks like stocks, land, appreciation of capital, we actually have things like when you trade capital, it's usually on international sites like NASDAQ, you have that public interest, and you also have selling it to another unique entity, so there's actually mechanisms there to improve enforcement. So now, because of the fact it's not income liquid anymore, you actually have assets, it actually has to go somewhere, be recorded, we think it's a lot more enforceable, we actually get enforceability there. We think they never modeled in progressivity, they just said, oh yeah, rich people, we think even if they do want to run something goofy like progressive capital gains taxes, we think that this is still disproportionate for middle income investors because it's not directly targeting that scaling part. We told you at Chris, we would stand for a threshold of above $10,000 and above $1 million profit for land transactions. We think this is a direct targeting to ensure we get actual egalitarianness and to ensure we actually target the rich people and not just squander the motion. Okay, we also think that progressive capital gains taxes uniquely punish the middle class earners because of the fact they're usually trading small amounts of stock, and this also looks like retirees trying to sell their home to retire. We think the comparative is that it's much better at the point we focus on reaching that particular threshold. Now we'll just go into refuting the first speech. They told us that they have capital gains tax, us too, but we needed to hear the unique benefits of significantly increasing the progressivity. We didn't hear any of this. Nothing of sufficiency, and they didn't even stand by the motion. So at this point, honestly, we lead. But I will refute their best claims because I think it's important that we still do this. They told us on education in Nigeria and hospitals. Okay, even if we do buy all of what they said, first of all, places like Nigeria are rampant with corruption. We don't think any sort of increasing of garnering taxes to their government or in these places that are corrupt, especially the developing countries, will at any capacity help it. But we also think it's really important for people to at least the middle class or even the poor people just to hold their income rather than give it to the government who probably will squander it. But we also think that at the point you have low corporate taxes because they wanted to increase corporate taxes exponentially, we think it's much better that if you have low taxes and say these developing countries, private entities can come in, they actually have an investment there, they can actually get infrastructure like they wanted to, like roads. We actually have a path for companies to want to go there if you don't hike taxes. But we also think we get jobs and employment. This is really, really good because now you have actually investment going on there. And we think that the IRD in developing countries literally doesn't work. We think assets traded internationally when we have capital gains tax will be much more effective, but we actually get jobs, companies going in there, even if you do don't buy anything I've said earlier. But we also think that their last little claim, this is their case, they said okay, Nordic countries. 3 responses. First of all, Nordic countries they do well because they have sovereign funds of oil. They literally do this because they get that revenue there. But we also think they have the lowest corporate tax gains in the world. Sorry, they have the lowest company taxes in the world. At the point companies want to go in there, companies want to trade, companies want to invest. How is increasing this suddenly going to help them? We think the reason they're doing good is because they have the lowest company taxes in the world. And both in any definition you buy today, we still take the lead. Okay. Now, onto the unique harms of company and individual incomes, and how taxes increasing aggressively in progressivity is really harmful. First of all, on small businesses, this is their final little case push. We told you, we just straight up reject this on the premise. We think that significantly increasing progressivity to the wealthier will definitely include small businesses. But we also tell you that rich companies literally say they have $0 profit, like Apple going to Ireland. And so when you actually do this is what happens. The rich companies literally don't pay the tax because you look at the things like the Laffer curve. At the point you have more tax, you want them to pay more. They just suddenly have that cost-benefit analysis. They're okay, we're going to hire more lawyers because they want to get us. So we think that we have now, rich companies just continue not to pay it, but they have now lower cost of production at the point they don't pay this tax because they have more of incentive not to. Their goods get cheaper. Their goods get more competitive. They outcompete the actual companies and businesses that do this. But we also think that rich companies who, other companies who might actually, if we buy it, even if companies do buy it, we think that now, with these companies, the cost-benefit analysis changes. So maybe they did pay the tax in the past, but now that you rampantly hike it up again, what's going to happen is they're going to be all right, the cost-benefit analysis changes here. Now I think it's more beneficial for me to not pay this tax and hire lawyers than pay this tax and not go into that field. But we also think that even if they do, I think they're much more likely to shift production to somewhere like a developing country, as we said earlier. But we think on the defense of companies, we think largely when you increase company tax exponentially, we think it decreases reinvestment investment, and you have like less product and process innovations, building off of what Chris said, less incentives to expand. And also, we think that companies are the ones that pay the wages for labor, the ones that produce our goods and services. We think that at the point you hike company taxes, you decrease
On that
employment
point.
because they want to cut costs, but also you have less growth, and also you have like increased consumer prices. At the point they want to pass on that tax to the consumers, on these are like necessities for the middle class, the lower class, who have to actually pay for things like toilet paper and pay for things like food. We think that also, at the point you have more company tax, small businesses will suffer more because richer companies still won't pay this, but now they probably will have to pay still that tax, or maybe even a little bit more. They still suffer, and the rich companies will be able to outcompete them even more. I'll take a POI from earlier.
Out of order.
No, okay. Not only do we get more tax revenue, but we also acquire it procedurally more egalitarianly without any of the detrimental harms to the middle class, etc. Why do we still get tax revenue? First of all, we still had capital gains tax, but we still have the progressive tax and the current status quo for most countries still have some sort of a tax gaining, but the marginal gain and any kind of additional tax is completely outweighed by the fact that the problem is not addressed where it needs to be. They're hyper obscenely rich, as they told us, but also we think the marginal harm to the middle class is extremely important. On equality, they told us, first of all, New Zealand has already a progressive tax system, but why are we still extremely unequal? It's because progressive taxation does not solve the issue. It's actually the hyper rich people. So we think all progressive taxes do is further the inequality, further the divide. At the point you burden the middle class with the tax paying, but we also don't improve anything like tax revenue or equality. On Neg, we want to shift this focus to the actually hyper rich. We don't want to piss off the middle class. We don't want them to hoard all their liquid funds into illiquid assets. We want them to actually have more liquidity. We want people to actually have buying. We want people to support these people. We want actually to have a better economic mobility. We want people in Nigeria to have an education at the point they can.
For that speech, and now we move to the replies portion of the debate, so I'd like to welcome back the leader of the opposition.
Panel, proposition today had to defend progressivity and scaling that increase in the tax system. They haven't done that. They've instead levied a capital gains tax by a threshold, which is not what they were here to do. 3 issues in this debate. First, on what the progressive tax system on earnings looks like. Second, the effects on equity. Third, the effects on small businesses. First, on what the progressive tax system on earnings looks like. We heard from proposition that they are taxing the ultra wealthy through a capital gains tax, so that's technically progressive because they get taxed more overall. Okay. We were clear from the start that progressivity of earning is to say that you scale that based on what we told you about. To say that as you increase in brackets, you pay more taxes, or there are more brackets so you encounter more of them. That is what we think significantly increasing progressivity means. We think significantly is what's important because it means that is a primary focus. It means significantly expanding the extent to which this is progressive. That means that we think 2 things. First, that they had to defend a tax on income and revenue because that is what earnings was referring to, and not wealth and asset appreciation. But second, that it must be scaling. Okay, they wanted to push a capital gains tax. We were charitable and said, let's be charitable and assume that they can push for a capital gains tax that is scaling. They still had to defend the scaling part of that, which they didn't give us at first about a model of. They didn't defend at second. And they basically, as they went down the line, just abandoned the idea of scaling altogether and just went, it's progressive because rich people are the ones getting taxed. That's not progressive, panel. That is literally just a new tax on rich people. That's not significantly increasing the progressivity of the current tax system. Okay. I think that for the most charitable case that they can defend then is a progressive capital gains tax system. Comparatively, we defend a threshold capital gains tax system above $10,000 for stocks, above $1 million for land purchases. That is, I think, a far better model for what the system should look like. We think that that is important because it feeds into these second and third issues. Second then is the effects on equity. This is important because proposition gives us a case that is about equity. They don't necessarily claim they want more tax revenue. They say, we don't want to tax the middle class more. They just want the ultra wealthy to redistribute some of their wealth. Okay, what are our response to this? Our response is to say, the progressivity of the tax system will only further burden the middle class. If you are truly about redistributing wealth from the top down, then naturally you would just impose a tax on the most wealthy. That is what we do, right? What they have instead done is implement, they have to defend a progressive capital tax system, which means they also defend taxes on, say, small stock trades by normal investors at home looking to improve their own wealth, or the retiree selling their home so they have the funds to move into a retirement home. That is the thing they have to defend. That is something they never engage with. That means that equity actually gets worse on proposition side of the house at the point you have a scaling system that disproportionately affects these middle income individuals. We also told you that when you have a threshold tax system, you get more public buy-in because it's an understanding there's only the ultra wealthy that is targeted, that everyone else benefit, as opposed to, look, we're funding the IRD so they can take more money from me. That does not get public buy-in. It also means that these IRDs can actually focus exclusively on these ultra wealthy, take more money from them, as opposed to doing things like take money from mom and pop investors, because it's simply easier to do that, right, without the teams of lawyers that they typically have. Finally then, on the effects on small businesses. Again, this is a point that they can't defend, because their essential claim is that by progressively taxing everyone with capital gains, rich, wealthy corporations get taxed more, and therefore small businesses will benefit. The two layers of response. The first is to say that this is symmetric at the point where we also tax the ultra-wealthy companies, but it is not symmetric at the point we tax them exclusively and more. That means that the small business that is doing some stock buybacks to drive their own expansion, that is gaining capital through expansions on land purchases, aren't affected. We only affect the ultra-wealthy companies that are exclusively doing stock buybacks above $10,000, the hugest purchases in the society. That means that everything they stand for is not progressivity. They stand for redistribution of wealth from the top down. That is not progressivity. That is literally what we have given you, the imposition of a thresholded capital gains tax. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank speakers for that speech, and now to close out the round, I'd like to welcome back the leader of the proposition.
Look, Nick's main substance throughout this debate has been a definition challenge. That is what their whole case has relied on. So before I get into the three key points that clash in this debate, let me just get that out of the way. They've had the false assertion throughout the debate that a capital gains tax is not progressive. We have pushed back through our bench by proving that a capital gains tax is a legitimate progressive tax on earnings, a different form of earnings on capital gains, as it targets wealthy assets. Their main response falls out of the debate completely, their main response being a capital gains tax, a thresholded capital gains tax, I may add, which is literally a form of progressive tax which we've introduced on our side of the house. That means that their counter model fits in with our side of the house, which is what we've been arguing for the whole time. They haven't provided any analysis on our other tax forms, like higher income tax, tax on companies, and multinational taxes offshore, which prevents a lot of their material surrounding tax fraud happening in the first place anyway. Progressivity exists on our side of the house. As we've proved this with the definition, I'll move on to my three key points of clash. The first one surrounding inequality. This is the most important point of clash. Secondly, is on small businesses, and thirdly is on social mobility. So inequality is the crux of the debate. If we win this point of clash, we win the debate, because this impacts our key stakeholder in the debate, which is poor people. Look, throughout the debate, the affirmative side has tried to prove that we can't gain the tax revenue that we said that we would do. They've said that the middle class is going to avoid this tax. They're going to commit tax fraud by taking in cash payments, which we push back on really strongly at third to no clear analysis in response, while also pushing the weird line in response that they're going to push a capital gains tax, and somehow, without providing any analysis, this is going to lead to reduced inequality. They haven't provided any analysis, while having this contradiction throughout what they're trying to push versus what we're trying to push, whereas in response, we've provided the clear mechanism from me at first and throughout our bench that increased tax everywhere through multiple means increases tax revenue significantly. With increased tax revenue, we can invest significantly in more social services for people, which is really important for vulnerable people in particular. And we've also pushed back on with the simple line that tax fraud is illegal. We have greater enforcement. This won't happen on our side of the house. The outcomes of this clash ultimately means that we have so many more social benefits. We have more hospitals, beds, nurses, doctors, etc. on our side of the house. We have better schools, classrooms, books. Really, really important to weigh in this debate. We have better education for girls in particular, which is really important to lift them up and to be able to provide them better opportunities, because they haven't had these opportunities provided to them in the past. with better amenities, better water sewage, roads, houses, etc., which is what people ultimately want. They want to live a life of comfort, and we are providing these opportunities to these vulnerable people. We have better jobs over the long run as well, as I proved in my first speech by saying that better education leads to better skills, which ultimately leads to higher paying jobs and better opportunities for the most vulnerable. Look, this ultimately means that the impacts of this clash means that we're creating better opportunities for the poor to be able to get ahead, to support themselves to get ahead, which would be completely denied under Negating's world, and ultimately this material must be weighed very highly. The second clash is around small businesses. This is a small clash, but ultimately there has been some pushback over which side of the house would better support small businesses. They said that small businesses are going to be disproportionately affected, they're going to suffer, they're going to pay higher tax. We've pushed back by saying that our tax system means that smaller businesses will be able to compete relatively better compared to bigger businesses, because these multinationals, like they've tried to say, like Apple going to Ireland and funneling all their tax, wouldn't be able to do so, as we provided clear mechanisms within our model for how this wouldn't happen through increasing like multinational tax in the Cayman Islands, for example, Ireland, etc. And they wouldn't be able to get away with this. Therefore, the outcomes of this clash ultimately means that small businesses are able to like get ahead, and this is really important because ultimately small businesses are more likely to support the local community compared to bigger businesses, and they're able to compete. This is important with this clash. And this final clash is around social mobility. This is a small clash, but there was some discussion around which side of the house has better social mobility. They basically said throughout the debate that the wealthy will be less socially mobile because they have less incentive to get wealthy. Look, we're pushed back at third by saying that there's still the incentive for wealthy to earn money. That incentive still exists regardless on either side of the house. And secondly, we're providing incentive for poor people to actually be able to get ahead, and we're providing them with the opportunity to be able to get ahead and to be able to move into higher paying jobs, higher skilled jobs. We're providing them with that social mobility on our side of the house. They haven't been able to push back on that with any effective analysis. So therefore, the outcomes of this clash and impact means that we're supporting poor people even more to be able to get ahead, to be more socially mobile. Seeing as we've won all 3 points of clash and proven their definition to be wrong, we have won this debate conclusively.
Thanks everyone for that debate. I'd like to invite you to the floor, shake hands if you wish to, and then if you all leave the room whilst we deliberate judiciously.
Good job.
Well done, good debate. Well done, good debate.
Sorry, I'm gonna go to the Basil now, but I'm maximising my time with Basil before you banish me.
Banish him?
You banish me from Basil, right? Like, I lose custody of my...
You do lose custody of Basil. An unfortunate truth.
I joked with the prep room. I was like, oh, like with Siobhan, and I was like, oh, I want to play capital gains tax. I guess arguably you can argue it on either side. Yes, you can argue it on either side.
Just on it, yeah. On the streams up, yeah. We watch.